There's a network of tunnels beneath Prague that doesn't appear on any tourist map. Not the famous medieval cellars where restaurants serve atmospheric dinners to visitors seeking authentic Czech experiences. Not the documented storage spaces beneath Prague Castle that architectural historians have catalogued and dated. Different tunnels. Older ones, more extensive ones. Sealed ones. I found them referenced in municipal records from the 1860s, engineering reports filed between brewery equipment inventories and grain, purchase receipts tucked away in archive boxes that hadn't been systematically examined by researchers in decades. Documents describing extensive underground networks that were officially designated as wine and beer storage infrastructure for Prague's famous brewing industry. But when I examined the technical specifications, the measurements didn't align with commercial storage requirements. The architectural descriptions were too elaborate for utilitarian space. The engineering details exceeded anything that commodity storage would justify. And in 1869, everything changed. Not through ordinary market forces or gradual commercial modernization. Through systematic administrative elimination that suggests someone in authority wanted these spaces permanently erased from Prague's urban landscape. The engineering surveys tell the first part of the story, and they're worth examining in detail because their unusual comprehensiveness reveals the true scope of what lay beneath Prague. Between 1867 and 1869, teams of municipal engineers conducted what can only be described as exhaustive examinations of underground infrastructure throughout Prague's Lesser Town and Old Town districts. These weren't routine safety inspections of the kind municipal authorities might conduct for basic compliance with Imperial building codes. They were systematic documentation projects that involved specialized teams working for months at a time, producing hundreds of pages of technical drawings, structural assessments, geological analyses, and measurements recorded with the precision normally reserved for major construction planning or architectural preservation efforts. The surveys used the most advanced engineering equipment available in the Austrian Empire, including theodolites for precise angle measurement, chain surveying for distance calculation, and plumb line techniques for vertical alignment, tools and methods that represented significant municipal investment in understanding these underground spaces with extraordinary accuracy. The documentation they produced reveals tunnel networks of remarkable scale and sophistication. Stone. Construction extending 8 to 12 feet in height and 6 to 10 feet in width, with some passages running for hundreds of meters beneath the city center without interruption. The stonework was analyzed using technical language that differentiated between mortaring techniques, joinery methods, and structural approaches that the surveying teams described as superior to contemporary standards and using methods not consistent with known local construction practices. The engineers noted specifically that whoever built these tunnels had access to advanced technical knowledge and construction expertise that exceeded what should have been available to local craftsmen working on typical commercial projects. Ventilation. Systems throughout the networks were mapped and assessed as examples of sophisticated engineering that demonstrated understanding of air circulation, pressure differentials, and climate control far beyond what wine or beer storage would require. Drainage infrastructure was documented as water management achievement that incorporated principles of hydrology and groundwater control, indicating builders with advanced technical training. These surveys were expensive, time-consuming, and thorough enough to support major renovation projects adaptive reuse initiatives, or commercial development ventures. Yet these exhaustive technical assessments were followed immediately by sealing orders rather than improvement contracts, sale negotiations, or development proposals. Why conduct such detailed, costly documentation of infrastructure you're planning to abandon permanently? The measurements recorded in those surveys don't match wine storage. 8 to 12 feet in height, 6 to 10 feet in width. Some passages extending hundreds of meters beneath the city center. Stone construction using techniques the engineers described as superior to contemporary standards. Ventilation systems more sophisticated than anything wine or beer storage required. Drainage infrastructure designed to handle water volumes that would never accumulate in commercial cellars. These were engineered spaces built to accommodate human movement and long-term occupation, not static storage of barrels and casks. More telling are the installations and architectural features that the surveys documented throughout these underground networks. The engineers found chambers containing absolutely no evidence of alcohol storage, no residual staining from wine or beer that would leave permanent marks on stone surfaces, no mounting brackets or hardware designed for supporting wooden barrels or metal casks, no spill drainage systems or collection channels that would be essential for preventing waste and maintaining cleanliness in commercial alcohol storage operations, no ventilation specifically designed to prevent the accumulation of fermentation gases that could become dangerous in enclosed spaces. Instead, these chambers contained installations and architectural features that the surveying teams couldn't identify or categorize according to any known commercial, residential, or civic purposes they'd encountered in their professional experience with Prague construction projects. Stone platforms had been built directly into the floors of multiple chambers, constructed with careful attention to specific dimensions and heights that seemed designed to accommodate groups of people in seated, standing, or reclining positions during extended periods of occupancy. These platforms weren't simple shelving or storage surfaces. They were too large, too deliberately positioned relative to room entrances and ventilation systems, and too carefully integrated with other architectural features to serve utilitarian storage purposes. The platforms showed evidence of sustained human use over months or years rather than occasional commercial access. Worn surfaces where people had regularly sat or stood, deliberate shaping that provided comfortable accommodation for human bodies, integration with lighting and ventilation systems that suggested long-term occupancy rather than brief visits for loading and unloading goods. Channels had been carved into walls throughout multiple chambers at specific, precisely measured heights that the engineering teams noted as being repeated throughout the network with remarkable consistency, suggesting coordinated planning and construction rather than ad hoc modifications by different users over time. These channels could have held lighting fixtures designed to illuminate spaces during human gatherings, ventilation pipes to circulate fresh air during extended occupancy, or decorative elements that would make architectural sense in ceremonial rather than utilitarian contexts. The channels were cut to exact specifications that indicated advanced knowledge of structural engineering and an understanding of how to modify stone construction without compromising structural integrity. Mounting points carved into stone walls and ceilings throughout the tunnel complex provided clear evidence that substantial installations had been supported in these chambers for extended periods. The mounting points showed wear patterns and stress marks, indicating that whatever they'd supported had been heavy, permanent, and regularly used rather than temporarily stored or occasionally accessed. The engineers noted that the mounting points were positioned at heights and angles that would accommodate ceremonial objects, meeting hall equipment, or residential fixtures rather than commercial storage apparatus. Most remarkably, the surveys documented finding rooms throughout the tunnel network that displayed acoustic properties the engineers described as exceptional and unlike any storage chambers in our professional experience. These were spaces where spoken words carried clearly across large areas without echo or distortion, where multiple speakers could address gatherings without their voices competing or creating confusion, where sound seemed to be enhanced and clarified rather than muffled by stone construction. The acoustic engineering required to create such spaces deliberately would have demanded advanced knowledge of sound propagation, architectural design for human assembly, and construction techniques that far exceeded anything required for simple commodity storage. The timing of Prague's tunnel sealing connects directly to broader patterns of administrative transformation visible across European cities in 1869, and understanding this wider context is essential for grasping what the sealing orders actually represented. Prague wasn't an isolated municipal government making independent decisions about local infrastructure management. It was an administrative center within the Austrian Empire, connected by telegraph networks to Vienna, Berlin, Paris, and other major European capitals. Integrated into political, economic, and communication systems that were systematically reshaping urban governance throughout Central and Western Europe during the 1860s and 1870s. The tunnel sealing orders emerged during exactly the period when comprehensive documentation and population management processes were intensifying throughout Habsburg territories as part of coordinated imperial policies designed to extend state administrative control deeper into urban and rural populations than any previous European government had achieved. This administrative expansion involved multiple interconnected initiatives that collectively transformed how people throughout the Austrian Empire related to governmental authority. New civil registration systems required every resident to be documented in imperial records with comprehensive personal information, including full legal names, current and previous addresses, detailed occupational information, complete family relationships, including parents and children, property ownership documentation, religious affiliations, and records of any previous interactions with imperial military, legal, or taxation systems. These registration requirements weren't voluntary suggestions or informal recommendations. They carried legal enforcement mechanisms, including substantial fines, potential imprisonment, and exclusion from employment opportunities, educational access, and commercial licenses for individuals who failed to comply within administratively specified timeframes. New taxation procedures demanded detailed knowledge of every household's economic circumstances, commercial activities, property holdings, agricultural production, and financial relationships, supported by comprehensive inspection systems that gave imperial officials legal authority to examine private residences, business premises, agricultural facilities, and personal financial records to verify compliance with registration and taxation requirements. New conscription systems required tracking every male of military age throughout the empire, with documentation networks that connected local recruitment offices to regional military commands to central imperial planning systems in Vienna. New property documentation systems required comprehensive mapping and legal registration of all real estate ownership throughout imperial territories, including not just surface buildings and agricultural land, but also mineral rights, water rights, forest resources, and, significantly, for this investigation, subterranean spaces including cellars, storage areas, tunnels, natural caves, and any other underground infrastructure that could potentially be used for commercial, residential, or civic purposes without imperial oversight and documentation. The cumulative effect of these interconnected administrative expansions was the creation of governmental infrastructure that made it increasingly difficult and ultimately impossible for anyone to exist within imperial territory without being visible to, documented by, and controllable by state authorities. For communities or populations that had previously operated outside Habsburg administrative reach, whether because they maintained traditional social and economic structures that didn't align with imperial bureaucratic categories, because their origins or activities were inconsistent with official imperial narratives about who lived where and when, or because they had compelling historical, religious, or cultural reasons to avoid registration, taxation, conscription, or other forms of imperial control. The 1860s represented an increasingly restrictive and potentially dangerous environment where autonomy and privacy were being systematically eliminated through expanded state surveillance and documentation systems. Consider what these tunnel networks provided. Underground areas where people could exist without appearing in imperial population counts, where economic activity could occur without generating taxable records, where community meetings could happen without imperial surveillance, where cultural and religious activities could continue according to traditional practices rather than imperial approval. The sophisticated ventilation, drainage, and acoustic systems documented in the surveys suggest these tunnels served exactly such purposes, providing sanctuary for autonomous communities that needed to remain invisible to expanding state oversight. The sealing orders issued throughout 1869 were systematic, comprehensive, and executed with unusual urgency that reveals the true priorities behind this municipal project. This wasn't gradual abandonment of individual tunnel sections as specific commercial leases expired or as particular storage spaces became economically unviable through ordinary market processes. Instead, Habsburg authorities coordinated systematic closure of the entire tunnel network within a compressed time frame of just a few months during the summer and fall of 1869. The administrative language used in these orders deserves careful examination because it reveals assumptions and motivations that don't align with routine municipal maintenance or commercial modernization initiatives. The orders mandated immediate permanent closure rather than temporary blocking pending future evaluation or potential alternative uses that might generate municipal revenue. They required comprehensive sealing rather than simple entrance barriers that could be removed if economic circumstances changed or if private investors expressed interest in purchasing or leasing the spaces. Most significantly, the orders applied uniformly to tunnel sections that the detailed engineering surveys conducted between 1867 and 1869 had explicitly described as structurally sound, architecturally significant, and potentially valuable for continued commercial or civic purposes. Municipal authorities were deliberately choosing to eliminate permanently valuable infrastructure rather than pursuing obvious alternatives like selling the spaces to private investors, leasing them for alternative commercial uses, or adapting them for civic purposes like emergency shelters, meeting halls, or storage for municipal equipment and supplies. Municipal budget records from 1869, preserved in the Prague City Archive, document expenditures for the tunnel sealing project that exceeded the combined annual budgets for road maintenance, public sanitation improvements, bridge repairs, and several major above-ground construction projects. The costs included not just basic materials like stone, mortar, and fill rubble, but specialized labor from engineering contractors with documented experience in complex underground construction, continuous supervision from qualified municipal engineers throughout the months-long sealing process, and what the detailed accounting records describe as comprehensive closure procedures requiring advanced technical implementation and specialized knowledge of underground construction methods and structural engineering principles. The scope of work involved wasn't simply bricking up tunnel entrances at street level and declaring the project complete. Municipal crews methodically filled entire chamber complexes with rubble and mortar, permanently destroying access to underground spaces that had been specifically praised in the recent engineering surveys as examples of exceptional stonework and architectural achievement that represented significant historical and cultural value. They sealed not just primary access points, but also secondary entrances, emergency exits, ventilation shafts, and drainage outlets, ensuring that the tunnel networks would be completely inaccessible from every possible direction. Time equals 1.5 seconds. They filled sophisticated drainage systems that had been specifically noted by the engineering teams as remarkable examples of water management infrastructure that demonstrated advanced technical knowledge and could have continued serving civic drainage purposes. They destroyed ventilation systems that the surveys had documented as superior to contemporary building standards and potentially useful for other municipal applications. The thoroughness of this destruction was extraordinary and extraordinarily expensive for a municipal government that routinely struggled to fund basic civic services and infrastructure maintenance throughout other areas of the city. The level of expenditure and the comprehensiveness of the elimination work suggests that the sealing accomplished something far more important to Imperial authorities than routine municipal housekeeping or public safety maintenance. Someone was willing to allocate substantial public resources that could have been used for schools, hospitals, roads, sanitation, or other civic improvements, to ensure these particular underground spaces became permanently and completely inaccessible to anyone for any purpose. The construction techniques documented in the surveys raise questions about the tunnel's origins. Stonework using methods that couldn't be identified in other Prague construction from documented periods. Engineering that demonstrated knowledge exceeding what local craftsmen should have possessed. These weren't vernacular storage spaces expanded by brewers. They were built by people with advanced technical capabilities working to specifications that served purposes beyond commodity storage. But who were these builders? When did they work? Official Prague architectural history has no framework to accommodate underground infrastructure of this sophistication and scale built outside documented construction periods. The 1870 Austrian census, conducted 9 months after the tunnel's sealing, doesn't show the population increases you'd expect if hundreds of underground residents had been forced to relocate to surface housing. Either the tunnel communities were smaller than the infrastructure suggests, or they left Prague entirely, or they were absorbed into institutional systems designed to manage undocumented populations. The same institutional systems, orphanages, asylums, poorhouses that were expanding throughout the Austrian Empire during exactly this period. Prague's tunnel sealing wasn't urban modernization. It was population control implemented through municipal engineering. The comprehensive surveys identified ungoverned spaces and documented their extent. The sealing work eliminated those spaces permanently. The timing coordinated with broader Habsburg initiatives to establish complete administrative control over imperial territory. No more spaces where people could exist outside state documentation. No more areas beyond the reach of taxation, registration, conscription. By the end of 1869, if you lived in Prague, you lived where imperial authorities could see you, count you, and control you. The broader European context makes Prague part of a larger pattern. London's systematic demolition of older neighborhood clusters. Paris's reconstruction after the Commune. Berlin's rapid imperial construction on previously occupied sites. Vienna's expansion of bureaucratic infrastructure. These weren't independent municipal projects. They were coordinated elements of a transformation that eliminated spaces where autonomous communities could operate outside state oversight. Prague's sealed tunnels represent one example of this systematic elimination of ungoverned space. The acoustic properties noted in the survey reports deserve particular attention. Chambers where spoken words carried clearly across large areas. Spaces where sound was enhanced rather than muffled. The kind of acoustic engineering required for community gatherings, teaching, ceremonial activities. Combined with the stone platforms, the carved channels, the mounting points for removed installations, these features point to underground meeting halls designed for communities that maintained cultural and social practices requiring concealment from imperial authorities. What happened to the communities that used these spaces? The documentary evidence suggests they were processed through the expanding institutional systems that characterized Habsburg administrative reform. Children separated and placed in orphanages where their origins could be obscured. Adults committed to asylums if they made inconvenient claims about their backgrounds. Families broken apart and absorbed into surface populations under imperial documentation systems. The tunnel ceiling eliminated their refuge. The institutional expansion absorbed their members. The process was comprehensive and coordinated. Modern Prague construction occasionally encounters blocked passages and filled chambers, evidence of the extensive networks that once existed beneath the city center. But systematic exploration is impossible because the 1869 ceiling was so thorough. The tunnels were filled, not just closed. Access was eliminated permanently, not temporarily. Whatever evidence they might contain about the communities that used them remains buried beneath tons of rubble placed specifically to ensure it would never be recovered. The wine cellar explanation provided administrative cover for what was actually the completion of imperial control over Prague's population. Municipal officials needed justification for expensive ceiling work. Modernizing obsolete commercial infrastructure sounded reasonable and progressive. It aligned with narratives about urban improvement. But the explanation doesn't account for the speed, expense, and thoroughness of the elimination. It doesn't explain why structurally sound, potentially valuable, space was destroyed rather than repurposed. And it doesn't address why 1869 specifically required such urgent, comprehensive action. Consider an alternative framework. The 1860s represented the final phase of territorial and population consolidation throughout Central Europe. the establishment of administrative systems requiring every person, every building, every economic activity to be documented and controlled. Prague's tunnel sealing eliminated the last refuges where alternative communities could maintain independence from imperial oversight. The physical erasure of ungoverned space. The forced integration of autonomous populations into state administrative systems. The completion of a process that made Habsburg territorial control total and absolute. The sealed tunnels remain sealed today. Whatever evidence they might contain about Prague's hidden communities, about construction techniques that exceed documented capabilities, about purposes that official history can't accommodate, that evidence stays buried. The 1869 sealing work achieved its goal. The spaces that provided alternatives to imperial control were eliminated permanently. The communities that used them were absorbed into institutional systems designed to eliminate their autonomy. Prague's underground landscape was cleared of anything that might complicate official narrative. Time equals 700 milliseconds greater than about who lived where, when, and why. The wine barrels that supposedly justified these elaborate underground networks leave no archaeological trace because they were never there. The real contents were human communities maintaining ways of life that the emerging modern state couldn't tolerate and wouldn't accommodate. They were cleared out, processed, and forgotten. The tunnels were sealed not to protect public health, but to ensure that the alternative Prague they had sheltered could never return.